Welcome, folks, to the Art of Agile Practice. This presentation is based on some material that I developed a few years ago, soon after Malcolm Gladwell's book Outliers came out. And at the time, I had been very inspired by his take on practice. And in the years since, things have changed and things have evolved. And so I want to share some of what I've learned and some of what I've seen changing along the way. I think everyone on the line knows who I am, but just by way of quick introduction, I'm Tom Perry. I'm an Agile transformation consultant and coach here in the Seattle area, and I'm author of The Little Book of Impediments and founder of Agile Management Northwest. And I think we're going to be looking at doing another Agile Management Conference, a virtual Agile Management Conference here soon. So stay tuned. So when it comes to Agile practice, I've broken this down into three elements. Introduction to deliberate practice and what the research tells us there. And then I'd like to share a little bit about what's called the improvement kata, which is a step-by-step method for using and incorporating practice into your work life. And then talk a little bit about the Agile skills that might be most useful or applicable when we're thinking about practice. And so that's really just tips and tricks for how we can apply these theories of practice to the Agile practices that we engage in every day. So starting with deliberate practice, as I mentioned, deliberate practice was really first popularized by Malcolm Gladwell when he referred to the 10,000 hour rule. And this was something that he referred to in his book Outliers. And Outliers in general was an examination of what makes certain people exceptional successes. And so it was very much a critical examination of how people manage to get themselves into peak performance states. And that encompassed a lot of things, but one of the things that Gladwell spoke about was this 10,000 hour rule. And he gave some examples of people who had spent a lot of time, significant amount of time in practice. And the examples were the Beatles, who I'm not a music historian, but apparently the Beatles spent a lot of time over in Germany, in Berlin, doing gigs in the red light district. And they spent years doing that, honing their skill before they actually became popular. And so another example would be Bill Gates. Bill Gates spent years working on a mainframe that he happened to have access to, and spent many, many hours honing his skill as a programmer. And then another example is Robert Oppenheimer. And so all of these were examples that Gladwell used to examine his notion of what made these great people successful. And the notion of deliberate practice wasn't Gladwell's. It was actually a guy by the name of K. Anders Ericsson, who subsequently has written a book called Peak, talking about how to use practice to achieve peak performance. And it was based on his research. This was very academic research that was looking at what kind of practice leads to really significant improvement. Because we all know that we can practice a lot of things really well or really poorly. And in this case, Anderson wanted to identify what really makes practice work for people. So with that in mind, let's look at what Anders Ericsson was talking about, and that was something called deliberate practice, which was a very, very specific type of practice. When it comes to deliberate practice, there are some characteristics of it, or attributes of deliberate practice, that are essential. First, it has to be designed to improve performance. It has to be the kind of thing, it's not just picking up the guitar and playing your favorite tune. It is the kind of thing where there's an explicit desire to improve some aspect of performance, and the practice is a designed skill aimed at enhancing that performance. It needs to be something that can be repeated a lot, and it needs to be focused on weaknesses. So it's not something that we just do over and over again. It's something that is very narrowly focused towards areas where we have weaknesses. It requires a coach, and feedback is continuously available. So when we're doing deliberate practice, we have somebody who understands the nuances of high performance and what good and bad look like, and they're there to evaluate our performance, and they're giving us feedback as frequently as possible. And more frequently, the better. And the more tangible or visceral that feedback is, the more we can feel that feedback, the better it is. And it's highly demanding. We can't level up until mastery is demonstrated here. So this is not easy stuff. It can be very hard work to do, and when you're doing it, it is a strain. It is not the kind of thing that you can sustain very long. So deliberate practice is hard to sustain beyond a couple of hours. So it's not the kind of thing where you can just rack up the hours really fast, because when you're doing deliberate practice, it's actually quite strenuous and difficult to do. So you have kind of limited periods within which you can do it before you need to take a break. Those were the four essential elements of deliberate practice as Anders Ericsson had defined it. And within that, that kind of takes away a lot of the misunderstandings about practice, where practice is simply repeating something mindlessly or doing something that's easy and trivial. That's not practice. And to really dig into that, deliberate practice is not the same as work. If I go out to work on the engine of my car, that's not practice. I'm getting something done, but it is not practice. It's not repetitive. It doesn't have the rapid feedback. It doesn't have a coach. It's not the same as play, although play has some great benefits. Deliberate practice is not play. And deliberate practice is not the same as rote repetition. So, for instance, memorization, I often do through some form of rote repetition. That's not deliberate practice. Deliberate practice involves really straining to achieve something new and frankly failing an awful lot. So that's deliberate practice as Gladwell was talking about it and as Anders Ericsson was talking about it. Now, in the years since, there have been a lot of critiques of this 10,000 hour rule. And the idea was that you had to put in 10,000 hours of deliberate practice before you could achieve world-class expertise in a domain. And so what they found since then is a lot of the examples that Anders Ericsson used and that Gladwell used were within domains that had very stable structures. So tennis or chess or classical music have rules that really never change. And so you can study those rules and become the best at performing those things. But there are other domains, less stable fields like entrepreneurship and rock and roll, where rules can go out the window. And so, it turns out that it may not be that it was really, and I think we can probably all think of, a band that we know of that perhaps didn't have a whole lot of technical excellence, but still became very, very popular very, very quickly, and were hailed as outstanding bands. But in terms of technical excellence and practice, were probably pretty weak. There was an interesting meta-analysis that was done on deliberate practice, and it was done on a meta-analysis is where they gather a whole bunch of studies that have been done, a whole bunch of academic studies on deliberate practice. And this number, they had 900 different studies that they were examining. And across all of those studies, they found some interesting numbers. 26% of the variance was found in performance for games. So if we're looking at games, practice could make upwards of about 26% of the difference. 21% for music, 18% for sports, 4% for education, and only 1% for professionals. So this is very interesting. It looks like that for the really structured stuff like games with well-defined rules or music or sports, where again, the rules are very, very well defined and we can hone our skills to basically specialize for those rules, it looks like we can get some significant benefit from practice. However, in domains that are much more akin to knowledge work or innovation work, it looks like practice plays a much, much smaller role, a much less significant role than it does for these other domains. So that's interesting to see. So I think that some of the examples that Gladwell gave and Anders gave were really specialized to certain domains. And when you start to look broader and ask yourself, well, how can practice help me in the business world? Well, the business world is much more dynamic in some ways. And so I think there are a couple of conclusions we can probably draw here. One is that I think Outliers, the book, Gladwell's book, was intended to challenge our notions of exceptionalism, looking at people who have achieved greatly and trying to understand what the real underlying factors behind those successes were. And so, in all fairness, Gladwell didn't just look at practice. Gladwell looked at birth order, he looked at access to resources, he looked at privilege, things like that. And so when you look at people like, for example, Bill Gates, he had access to a mainframe exclusively in the 70s, which no one else had. He also had a mother who was on the board of directors for IBM. So he was in a very, very exclusive and privileged position when it came to programming. Similarly, Oppenheimer had a very privileged upbringing. And so, there's a lot of things that goes into success, and practice plays a role, but I don't think we should overstate it. However, I think the other thing that we can take away from this is that in knowledge work and business practice, it plays an important role in defining repetitive activities. So if we have in business, if we're looking at manufacturing, for example, it may be that practice can play a very useful role. But in knowledge work, like software development, it's a little bit less clear how exactly practice can help us out. And so, and this is based on a few years of people looking at and critiquing some of the ideas of Gladwell and Anders Ericsson. And I still think they're very relevant, and I think they've been very helpful in terms of guiding us towards what we might do with practice. But suffice it to say that the story isn't fully written yet. So next thing I'd like to do is talk about something called the improvement kata. And the improvement kata was something that was originally developed by Mike Rother, and it really comes from the lean world. And so Rother was convinced of a couple of things. One, that concepts don't change mindset or behavior. So, and what he means by that is many concepts lack a real means of operationalizing themselves. And so I think we see a lot of this in the Agile community, where we run around trying to teach mindsets. And that's extremely challenging, and I think a lot of the time fails, quite frankly. And part of the reason for that is because it's not tied explicitly to behaviors. And the behavior change doesn't happen unless you start practicing that behavior in a new environment. And so we want to try and look at this as a challenge if we want to get to changing mindsets. We need to establish new skills. And so the way Rother uh, recommends that we go after this is by using the PDCA framework, plan, do, check, act, and use that to give us, basically he's seeking some sort of feedback cycle. So this feedback cycle that he's talking about should have us all basically thinking, okay, feedback, that's one of the elements in deliberate practice. So Rother is starting to take advantage of some of the elements of deliberate practice and put those in place in order to change mindsets. And so this is a quick summary of what he calls his improvement kata and his coaching kata. And for those who aren't familiar with kata, kata is a Japanese term that describes a practice that you go through. And so where I first saw katas used was when I was a kid and I took karate lessons. And so you would go through these series of exercises or poses to practice the different defensive and offensive elements of karate. And you see that in many of the martial arts. It's a way of practicing at an individual level the motions or practices necessary for martial arts. And so it actually in Japanese, it's used to refer to any kind of practice. So it could be that it's used for refining your practice of things like poetry. It also, gardening could be a kata. All of these things have certain practices associated with them. Again, Rother is blending in a little bit of deliberate practice here in that he believes that a kata needs to take place with a coach present. And so having that coach present is essential for kata to actually work. And so we have a coach, and the coach is watching the student as they're going through their practice, giving them rapid feedback daily at the very least, as they try and adopt new practices. And again, it's by adopting these new practices that we hope we can change mindsets, not the other way around. So the improvement kata has been used, and I think this is up for a little debate, but the idea here is it's in the lean community. And as we all know, the lean community has done a great job of focusing on processes and also, frankly, focusing on manufacturing very, very well. And that's really where it originates from. And so this idea of honing practice, standardizing practice, getting good at practice fits in very well in that manufacturing context, which, as I suggested before, is a great place for practice because there are well-defined rules. However, that brings me to where I think most of us live. And we oftentimes are doing things in a world full of rather ambiguous processes and business domains that change very rapidly. And so that's where I get to the question of what skills can we practice and how can we utilize what we've learned about deliberate practice and what we've learned about the improvement kata. So to go there next, when I think about agile skills, here are a few categories of coaching of agile skills. There's coaching, there's coding, there's collaboration, and delivery. I'm pretty sure there are probably some others. Does anybody have anything they just want to blurt out? Okay, we'll roll with that then.
Well,
So
maybe planning, Tom.
yeah, and I think that might be a good top level category. If we look at the Scrum practices, whoops, my graphic there is cutting off my title. Planning is certainly a practice that we say is one of the key practices, the 5 key practices in Scrum. There's retrospectives, stand-ups, the refinement meeting, and the review. And while I think those are things that can be fairly dynamic activities, the fact is they're all the types of activities that we repeat over and over and over and over again. And so getting good at these things is important. Doing them well can be the difference between a really excellent team and a team that is thrashing if you're unable to really do a good job with these things. And I can think of one example, which would be the retrospective, which is probably one of the most abused practices in Scrum, and could probably use, some real skill behind it. Similarly, the stand up, I think, gets a lot of abuse as well. So these are things where you could practice these things. Now, one of the things that Rother suggests is I think he understands that in the business environment, there is a lot of ambiguity. And so what he suggests we do is identify the next step in towards whatever goal we have. So if our goal is to improve our retrospectives and we're unsure as to how to do that, we might start with the next, what's the first step in a retrospective? Maybe data gathering. And so we would focus on data gathering first and find a practice for data gathering that we find most effective and get good at that before we move on to the integration phase and the summary phase and the different parts of retrospective. So basically break down these big activities to something that is smaller and easier to tackle and easier to define. Some of these also, I think, are a little problematic. For example, and my dog says hi, by the way. The the um, the retrospective has a lot of different ways of performing it. Just off the top of my head, I can probably think of 20 different ways of running a retrospective. Stand-ups, pretty conventional. Pretty much they all run more or less the same. Um, Backlog refinement, that can vary a lot. And reviews certainly can as well. So that variation also gives us additional opportunities for practice. So if there are many different techniques we can use for retrospectives, then we can practice some of those techniques and get better at using them. Another place that I looked for practices was XP. So XP has a stated set of practices, and there's test-driven development and refactoring and pair programming, collective ownership, and the planning game, which is really the same as planning in Scrum, more or less. So here we come close to a new idea. Well, no, I should restate that. It's an old idea now called the Coding Kata. And the Coding Kata has been around for at least 15 years. And the idea is that you can practice solving problems, coding problems, and getting more effective at solving those problems by going through and repeating the solution and examining the solution over and over again. And so there is a whole collection. You can go out, and if you just Google Coding Kata, you will get a whole bunch of different coding kata ideas. And some are very, very simple and trivial, and some are quite complex. And all of them are aimed at enhancing different areas of your skill set as a developer. And that would cover, there are coding katas for TDD, there are coding katas for refactoring. Pair programming is a little bit more of an interpersonal exercise. And collective code ownership actually, I think, is much more of an umbrella term for a bunch of smaller practices that deliver on collective code ownership. So those are some areas where we could be using practice that have, I think, well-defined domains to them and well-defined rules. Are there any others that you look at? There's one other that I can think of, which is coaching dojos, which is another way of practicing our coaching skills. And a coaching dojo is very simple. You can do it with two or three people. Typically, there's someone, the coachee, somebody who has an issue. There's the coach who is going to listen to that person and provide advice. And then there's an observer. And you spend 5 minutes with the person, the coachee describing their problem, the coach providing whatever advice or recommendations they have, and the observer is taking notes and then provides feedback at the end of those 5 minutes to share what sort of behaviors they saw taking place between the two people. And then you can rotate this. And so I've done this with groups of coaches, and it can be very, very useful for refining your practice of coaching. And really, I think when I've done it, we've always gone with we've started with a model to use. And that model gives us a series of steps. It could be the GROW coaching model. It could be any coaching model that works for you. But the idea here is it's something that you want to enhance, refine, and get better at. Are there other examples people might have?
Yeah, I think one of the things I find teams struggling with over and over is splitting stories, and I think splitting stories would enormously benefit from practice.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I agree. And that I think you can establish some pretty, when I think about it, well-defined rules.
Mhm.
It's easy to come up with a lot of different cases, so it's not hard to come up with raw material for that. And some of those cases can be quite challenging. So I think that's the kind of thing. It's non-trivial, especially when you start talking about architecture. It can be very, very hard. So I think that's a great example. Thank you. Any others? Alrighty. So just so you know, I've got upcoming classes and services. So if you go to Thomas Perry LLC, you can find links to my training that I offer. I offer the typical intro to Agile, but I'm a little bit of a creative type, so I do business thermodynamics, removing barriers to execution, intro to process experimentation. So I think these are areas where I really think there's a lot to be gained. I offer SAFE certification as well, leading SAFE and all of the various and sundry classes there, as well as training and coaching and management consulting. So tell your friends, let them know, and thank you very much for your time. If you have any questions, now's your time.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Tom.
Yeah, thank you guys.
That was very interesting. I'm a fan of Malcolm Gladwell, um, of the thinking he brings to the fore, and the 10,000 hours one is definitely one to think about,
Yeah,
and the difference between practice and doing.
yes, yes, absolutely. And like I said, I think he's received some criticism in recent years, but I think I think the book Outliers did a whole lot to at least make the work of Anders Ericsson visible to a broader audience, and to start a really healthy conversation, like you said, about the difference between practice and doing. And people like Mike Rother are now incorporating that into a real system that's worth taking a look at, because Rother is trying to apply it to the work that we do. And I think that's where we need to be keeping our eye.
Does Rother have a book?
Yes, he does. Rother has written on lean topics quite a bit. He's an academic type, and I am looking for. He wrote one of those big. He worked He worked at Toyota, so he's one of those TPS guys, and he wrote a book on the Toyota production system, and he's very closely associated with LEI, the Lean Enterprise Institute. So I can't remember the name of his book off the top of my head, But if you go to, um, I think it's the Toyota Kata, um, or just look up Mike Rother. He has a web page, and he has been very generous with his resources. So there are lots and lots of presentations, lots of handbooks and things like that. He's got a great deal of work there, so it's well worth exploring.
Did you find Anders Ericsson's book Peak uh, adding to your understanding, uh, giving you another leap beyond what Gladwell wrote in Outliers?
Actually, I found it. The thing that was tough about it was that his writing was very much focused on these narrow domains, and I loved it. So in my first presentation that I did on this, there are a lot of riffs you can take on this. For instance, if you look at music, some of the techniques that they use um, to practice are things like speeding up, playing the music much faster, so that you test your dexterity and you make more mistakes. The opposite of that is slowing down dramatically, so holding each note for an exaggerated period of time. Again, stresses you out and makes you make mistakes. And so that slowing down and speeding up is something that you see generalized as a practice across many different disciplines. For example, athletes will do things very slowly and very quickly. And you see sprinters who do things to slow themselves down, like run with that silly little parachute dragging behind them, or dragging a load behind them, doing things to slow themselves down or speed themselves up and put themselves under additional strain. So those kinds of insights I got from looking at Ericsson's book and thinking about how this is applied in other places. But ultimately, it didn't help me much. And this is where I felt confused. It didn't help me understand how to use it in a business domain. Or even more specifically, how could I use it to make myself better at what I do? And so I had some thoughts around that. I mean, a lot of our work, oftentimes when you're doing training, for example, is really just presentation and delivery. And that's something that can be practiced and refined and improved. And so I think there are areas in training that respond well to practice. There aren't a lot of rules, but when it comes to coaching, there's the coaching dojo that helps, but that's about it, because an awful lot of it is very nuanced. It's very dynamic. People can throw weird stuff at you that doesn't have a lot of rules, and it relies on your own intuition. So I think it gets very complicated and fuzzy once you get into a business domain. I'm passionate about it because I really think that I want to find ways to be that world class person who is able, that world class coach, that world class trainer, that world class scrum master who can really help people out. And so I think it's worth paying a lot of attention to this to see if it gives you and inspires you with ideas that can help you get better.
Yeah, what's the difference between a dojo and a kata?
Oh, I think a dojo is a kind of kata. It's a practice. So a dojo, it's a good, I mean, I'm going to be a little careful about that, because I think a dojo in specific Japanese terms is a place that you go to practice. I think that's what a dojo actually is. Um, it's the actual place you go to, whereas the kata is what you do inside the dojo. So technically speaking, I think if you ask somebody who is a Japanese speaker, I'm sure they would say there's a very important difference. Um, why they've named the coaching dojo, a coaching dojo and not the coaching kata, I have no earthly idea.